Great. Well, welcome. I'm Matt Wasniewski, and I'm with the Public History Committee. And you are at our Hot Topics in Public History, the Gulf Oil Spill, Contextualizing the Present, Documenting for the Future. And I'd like to thank Louis Hutchins first for helping organize this panel. Louis is the chair of the Public History Committee. And also thank the other committee members. Julia Sandy Bailey is here. She's one of them. Kathy Franz, Anthea Hartig, and also the OAH liaison, Susan Ferentinos. I thought I'd start with a timeline to put the events of the past year into some perspective. A little less than 11 months ago, on April 20th, 2010, an explosion and fire occurred on the Deepwater Horizon, killing 11 workers. Owned by Transocean Limited and licensed to British Petroleum, this rig had been working on a well 42 miles off the southeast Louisiana coast, the Macondo Prospect, located in 5,000 feet of water and reaching an additional depth of 13,000 feet under the seabed. 2 days later, on the 40th anniversary of Earth Day, the Deepwater Horizon sank and an oil slick formed. On May 2nd, British Petroleum, BP, began drilling a relief well, a process that eventually consumed more than 4 months. On May 7th, an effort to contain the leaking wellhead with a containment dome failed. It was the first of several unsuccessful strategies to cap the well. On May 19th, the first oil reached Louisiana marshlands. On May 22nd, President Barack Obama announced the creation of the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which released its findings this past January 11th. On June 2nd, U.S. officials expanded the area of a fishing moratorium in the Gulf to cover more than a third of federal Gulf waters. On June 16th, BP established a $20 billion fund for damage claims. On July 15th, 2010, for the first time in 87 days, the flow of oil into the Gulf was stopped as BP announced that it had capped the well. On August 2nd, 2010, U.S. government scientists estimated that the size of the spill was 4.9 million barrels, equivalent to 206 million gallons. The volume of the spill at the Macondo wellhead was somewhere on the order of 20 times greater than the Exxon Valdez spill. On August 3rd, a static kill procedure to push oil and gas back into the reservoir succeeded. On October 12, 2010, the Obama administration announced it was lifting a ban on deepwater drilling in the Gulf that it had imposed shortly after the accident, but it approved the first permit to drill a deepwater well only this past February 28, 2011. Obviously, this is an unfolding event still, and we're very fortunate to have a distinguished group of panelists with us today who are going to help us make better sense of these still unfolding events. Two historians, Brian Black of Penn State to my far right, and Tyler Priest to my near right of the University of Houston, are going to discuss the spill by situating it in a larger historical context of environmental disasters. And anthropologist Diane Austin, to my right, from Arizona, University of Arizona, and oral historian Louis Kyriakoudes from Southern Mississippi, University of Southern Mississippi, will focus on the spill's consequences for the Gulf region particularly, and how historians are working through oral history interviews and other documentary methods to record the spill for future generations. Where does it rank in terms of other environmental disasters? From a historical perspective, what have the challenges and potential pitfalls of new technologies been as they've come online to replace other methods of extraction? To what degree have past energy-related disasters spurred reforms, alternative energy resources, or wider debate about the environment? And what has been done to record the long-running narrative of offshore oil extraction, one which dates back to the 1940s? And also, what is the role of historians, both public and academic, in assessing and recording these crises? We've allotted each panelist 10 minutes of comments. We may range a little bit over that. So I would ask that you hold questions till the end of the formal commentary period. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Tyler Priest, who is the Clinical Professor of Business History and Director of Global Studies at the C.T. Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. During 2010, he served as a senior policy analyst for the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Oil Spill and Offshore Drilling. Tyler is a leading expert on the history of the offshore oil and gas industry. In 2008, he won the Geosciences in the Media Award from the Association of American Petroleum Geologists for his book, The Offshore Imperative, Shell Oil's Search for Petroleum in Post-War America. The American Society for Environmental History awarded him its Alice Hamilton Prize for his article, Extraction Not Creation, The History of Offshore Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico. In 2010, Ty was a co-recipient of the U.S. Department of the Interior's Partners in Conservation Award for his work on the Minerals Management Service study, History of the Offshore Oil and Gas Industry in Southern Louisiana. He is currently the principal investigator on 2 other Bureau of Ocean Energy Management studies related to the Gulf. His current book project is entitled Deepwater Horizons, Managing Offshore Oil and Gas in the United States, and he's also co-editing a special issue of the Journal of American History for June 2012 on the history of oil in the United States. Please welcome Ty Priest.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks also to Lewis Hutchins for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I was just at the plenary session on 9/11 where a couple of the panelists talked about the difficulties of analyzing such a recent event for historians. And so this is certainly a disaster that's still unfolding, as Matt said. I think it's always useful to, for me anyway, to keep in mind the observation made by Steve Piku, the sociologist from the University of South Alabama, who has studied the social impacts of the Exxon Valdez, that there's a difference between a technological disaster and a natural disaster. Natural disasters can unify communities in the collective effort at mutual support. Technological disasters divide communities as the struggles over damages and compensation and the legal complications from all that wear on. It took almost 20 years for the punitive damages to be sorted out with Exxon Valdez. And Piku says that there are two disasters. There's the initial disaster, and then there's the legal disaster that follows. And the people on the Gulf are still living through both of those. They're not over yet. And it only comes several years after another disaster. It was both a natural disaster and technological disaster in the 2005 hurricane season. On top of it, you have the recession and the general stoppage in economic activity in Louisiana. It's hard really to imagine the suffering that's going on there. So it's it's always important to keep that in mind. I'm going to talk a little bit about doing public histories of this event and of offshore oil in the Gulf of Mexico. Last month, I was at a forum across town at Rice University, and the theme of the forum was called U.S. Offshore Exploration, Managing Risks to Move Forward. And the lead speaker, a consultant, an oil consultant from D.C., started off the conference by saying we need to move forward and not look backward. There's too much at stake. U.S. energy security is at stake. The Gulf of Mexico is the #1 area for growth for domestic energy supplies. There are jobs at stake, and he claimed that there were that a long-term stoppage in drilling and activity in the Gulf could jeopardize 285,000 jobs. And I'm not really sure where he got that number, but there are a lot of jobs. And this effort, this message that we need to move forward, began much before last month. It actually started after the well was capped. This is a photograph I took in Washington that was of a shell ad that was put up in November when the chief counsel for the National Spill Commission was presenting its findings. This is 2 blocks away from the commission headquarters. The message couldn't have been any stronger, right? Decisions, let's make some, let's go. And if you can see, find out our position on the key issues concerning the world's energy future. The future is what we need to focus on now, not the past. And the industry and its political supporters frequently insist that the Macondo blowout was an anomaly in the long history of safe operations in the Gulf. It was a one in a million incident, a black swan event, or in this case, more appropriately, probably a black pelican event. And we can safely move forward without interrogating the past. Now, I agree that we need to move forward, and there are a lot of people in the Gulf who don't want to dwell on the past. But as we move forward, we certainly cannot deflect our attention from the past. The multiple successive failures at the Macondo well suggest that there are problems that go beyond this single well and beyond BP and even the other companies implicated in the disaster. Unless there's some across-the-board changes in operating practices and regulatory oversight, there's a good chance that the Macondo well will not be an aberration. And even a drilling expert at that very forum that I attended last week said he was pretty sure that it's not an aberration, and it could easily happen again. So we need to understand what kind of change is needed, but in order to do that, we need to reflect on the past. The past, I think, is the key to holding the development of offshore oil and gas to a higher level of public accountability. And we have to remember that the Outer Continental Shelf is federal land, and the resources that are extracted there are, as well as the shoreline and the ocean environment, are public trust resources. They don't belong to the oil and gas company. And when you hear people in the industry, and understandably so, but when you hear them say, give us our permits right now, you have to remember that, it's not their oil. It's the public's oil. And it's supposed to be managed in the public interest, and it follows that the history of this industry should be widely accessible to the larger public. And so the Minerals Management Service, since renamed BOMER, has not received much credit for anything in recent years. But it does deserve some credit for making the history of offshore oil and gas accessible to a larger public. And for Diane and I have collaborated for the last 10 years or so. Does it seem like 10 years, or does it seem like a lot longer than 10 years? On 3 studies that were commissioned by the MMS on the history of the Gulf of Mexico, which was completed and formally completed in 2008. And our teams from UH and from the University of Arizona collected and transcribed about 450 oral histories that are archived at the University of Houston and other archives in the region. And Diane can maybe tell you about some of the traveling exhibits that they in particular developed for that project. We have 2 other ongoing studies, one on the shipbuilding and fabrication industry and one on the history of deep water, that will probably produce at least another 100 or 150 oral histories. But all the experience that I had in researching the history of offshore oil didn't prepare me for the barrage of media inquiries about the history and technical aspects of offshore oil that followed the disaster. The demands for historical accountability were overwhelming, as they should have been, but nobody in the industry was talking. There are a few historians, can't even probably count them on one hand, who even care about the issue. And the news story had such long legs, and the containment, in response to the spill was so drawn out that there was waves of new inquiries with each new development. And personally, I felt like I was trying to do history on the run, and I wasn't doing it as well as I thought I could. It was incredibly frustrating. Some questions were easier to deal with than others. How does the spill compare to spills in the past, and you know, I can talk a little bit about that maybe in the question and answer period if people have questions about that. There were other questions that I couldn't answer, especially on technical matters. You know, how has the technical requirements of blowout preventers and the regulation changed as the industry moved into deep water? There were questions that were, you know, I had some idea about, but were extremely complex to answer, like the relationship, coexistence between the shrimp and fishing industry in Louisiana and the oil and gas industry. It's not easy to really to explain in sound bites. The most unsettling questions were ones I had never thought of, or ones that I had thought of, but I had never gotten around to answering. How does the safety record in the Gulf of Mexico compare to offshore provinces in other countries, like the North Sea? You know, I think that's a very important question. It had been in the back of my mind, but it was not, you know, part of my research agenda, and it left me second guessing my research agenda as this unfolded. I found myself questioning my own objectivity too, as I was asked about the regulatory failures at the MMS, an agency with which I had contracted to do history, and which I served on a federal scientific advisory board for. And the most troubling question I had to ask myself was, in all my years of researching this subject, why had I not prepared for the possibility of something like this to happen, and what that would mean, and what kind of demands that would place on the history that I was doing. I think I assumed, or maybe internalized, the industry's own outlook, like this couldn't happen. But fortunately, the frustrating public history work I was doing on my own was bolstered by the creation of the President's National Oil Spill Commission, which took up many of these unanswered questions. And I felt really privileged to serve on the senior staff, and I was immensely impressed by how seriously the commissioners and the lead staff approached the task of documenting the history of offshore oil, and documenting the history of federal oversight, and the history of environmental transformation in the Gulf region. And here, I pull up the website here, because if you haven't looked at this, there's a lot of good stuff here for historians. The final report, in my own unbiased opinion, is good history. This whole first part is historical. Chapter 2 is a history of the industry. Chapter 3 is a history of federal oversight. But there's a lot more for historians than just this final report. There's a lot of good stuff in there. You probably get the most comprehensive and contextualized discussion of this disaster in that final report. If you go to the Chief Counsel's report, which was released recently, which is even longer than the final report. This is Fred Bartlett's team that looked into the root causes of the disaster. And this might be a good teaching resource. There are all these animation clips that were used in the presentation of their findings, that if you have no understanding of offshore drilling, really present it in very clear and graphic views. This animation describes the basics. So there's about 20 of these different clips that show you what happens. And then the other place I'd like to direct historians who are interested in this is this multimedia site where there's a 10-minute introductory video, but there's also, we develop historical timelines. One on the history of the offshore oil and gas industry since 1896, the first drilling off of California. And you know, you can follow along the timeline, and as you do follow along, you can see, you know, how primary energy consumption in the U.S. has increased, and the percentage of oil that's coming from shallow water and deep water. And there are two other timelines, one on regulating offshore drilling, one on offshore oil and gas disasters. But I think, and those are good teaching resources, but I think the most valuable part of this, and that few people are aware of, are the staff working papers for documenting the past. And there are 22 staff working papers on all the topics that were of relevance. These are longer versions of research and findings that may not have made it into the final report, or made it in, but not in the kind of detail that you can find in these papers. You can read about dispersants, you can read about the amount and the fate of the oil, you can read about the seafood industry in Louisiana. A lot of the research was historical, contextualizing the issues of liability and compensation, science in the federal government, the NERDA process, the National Contingency Plan. All these things are in here. And the one staff paper that I wrote for this was the long version of the history of offshore oil and gas in the United States. And plus there's other research that non-commissioned staff did that are also included on this. So it's a very valuable resource. I think it's probably the most accessible place to start for gathering data and contextualizing this spill historically. The Commission developed an incredible amount of baseline research that I think will also be valuable to historians of the future. I think this is important because in 20 to 30 years from now, and maybe Brian may try to contradict me here, but hydrocarbons will still be the primary source of energy for our nation, probably the world, and the majority of those will be harvested from the ocean. And so the need for historical accountability for offshore oil will be even greater than it is now. Many of the commissioners were certainly not friends of the oil industry, but I think they all came to accept that offshore drilling in the Gulf is not a choice. Rather, it's like the title I chose for my book, an imperative. But we should also remember that the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi Delta are critical nodes in a much larger distributional system. More than half, not only does the Gulf produce a third of our domestic crude oil, but more than half of the crude oil that we import comes through the Gulf. The Gulf is the drainage outlet for 2/3 of the U.S. continent. It's an important landing station for the hemispheric migration of birds. And it's a large part of our seafood supply comes from the Gulf. So we better get it right. And to get it right, we need to look at how we got it wrong in the past. And there are many things to look at in the work of the Commission, but I would direct you to two things which I think are extremely important. The lead recommendation that came out of it was improving the safety of offshore operations. That's the first and foremost issue. And to do that, you really have to understand what happened in the 90s, especially from about 1990 to 1998. And the only way you can really understand it is by making international comparisons, because there were a series of offshore disasters in the 1980s experienced by Norway and Great Britain and Canada that caused them to overhaul their regulatory systems, install new independent safety authorities, and adopt new approaches to risk assessment and management. And while they were doing that, nothing changed in the United States. Even though this is a global industry, we treat it like a national industry. Nothing changed, and oversight was even scaled back dramatically. At the very same time, there was a rapid acceleration of deepwater drilling and production in the Gulf of Mexico. This is an era of deregulation, fiscal restraint, political struggles over offshore revenues, which deflected attention from offshore operations, and the regulatory function severely atrophied. And I think to put this in kind of a larger context of the era in American history that began in the 1990s, I think that two of the defining themes are going to be excessive risk-taking by the private sector and the degradation of government capacity to control and manage those risks. And the parallels between the Gulf spill and the financial crisis of 2008 are striking. I'm not the only one to have made these comparisons, but in both cases you had externalized risks, complex and fast-changing technological innovations, and lax oversight, which combined to create disaster. And so we do need to manage risks to move forward. But I think the key question is, can we leave it up to the private sector to self-regulate and manage risks. And I think the historical lessons from the financial crisis and the Gulf spill remind us that, as historian David Moss puts it, when all else fails, government is the ultimate risk manager. And this is all the more important when we're dealing with public trust resources, like those on the Outer Continental Shelf. And in the last 20 years, in oil and finance and other industries, we have disabled the federal government from performing this function, and we're now experiencing assault on the very notion of a public good, as one of the presenters in the plenary session pointed out. So I think if we leave it this way, we are moving in a very dangerous direction. And I'm happy to talk more about what were some of the big changes in the 90s, but that's the key decade to focus on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ty. Our next speaker is Brian Black. He's the professor of history and environmental studies at Penn State, Altoona, where he currently serves as head of arts and humanities. His research emphasis is on the landscape and environmental history of North America, focusing on the application and use of energy and technology. He's the author of several books, including the award-winning Petrolia, The Landscape of America's First Oil Boom, and the forthcoming Contesting Gettysburg, Preserving a Cherished American Landscape. He's currently working on 2 books on petroleum: Crude Reality, Petroleum in World History, which is scheduled for publication in Rowan and Littlefield's McNeill Bentley series on world history, and Declaring Our Dependence, Petroleum in 20th Century American Life, which is scheduled for a trade release with the University of Chicago Press. Brian's a former editor of Pennsylvania History and has served on numerous editorial staffs, including Scholastic Magazines, Audubon, American Studies, the Journal of Economic History, and Military History Quarterly. His reviews and opinion pieces have appeared in the Christian Science Monitor, USA Today, and History News Network. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Anybody know which one of these was mine? Oh, yeah, thank you. Where's the view thing over here?
F5.
You got it. Beautiful. If you guys want to shift, feel free. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for putting together a wonderful session. You're going to I think, realize from our panel, one of the reasons I was really looking forward to this session, a good can come from a very bad occurrence. And this kind of introspection is exactly the good that I think can come from it. And 20 to 30 years, I won't argue with you about that. That's a pretty small window. So, so we can go with that. My role is going to be historical context. And so I'm going to be reading from some comments, and then again, just leaving it open to questions at the end, and I'll be glad to talk more about any of that. Looks like it changed my fonts on the computer, so my apologies for any straggling text. Okay. Each of the major news channels carried the same inset video image to accompany its primary news story: the sheared-off industrial pipe from which erupted swirls of black and gray plumes. A churning cloud of impenetrable grime, the plumes we knew with neither explanation from technological experts nor corporate leaders was oil and natural gas. Once it passed beyond the limits of our view, its destination would be the marine ecosystem of the Gulf of Mexico, bathing coastal birds in a coating of crude and introducing petroleum into the deep water ecology. The live video feed, never deviating from its constricted focus on the wellhead, merely suggested these larger implications of the BP oil spill of 2010. No doubt, the spill has earned a spot in the eco-disaster pantheon with Love Canal, Chernobyl, and Bhopal, and others. However, by merely defining the spill in this way, we are missing the larger lesson that currently surrounds us and threatens to engulf us. No mere environmental disaster, this episode is the latest industrial calamity to instruct us on the errant course of our current energy regime. Organized around the harvest and burning of fossil fuels, the live video feed and the Gulf spill in general pulls back the curtain to reveal the inherent pitfalls of the acquisition of oil. As viewers and consumers, it is our duty to expand the meaning of this event from unfortunate accident to a referendum on an era of energy gluttony. As historians, the context from past events and trends that we can add to this event only reinforces this hard truth. The role of public historians to gather the records of this event and to make them available for public consumption, in my opinion, may be the most critical. There were no live video feeds when the first commercial well of crude was struck in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, subject to some of my earlier work. It was a sloppy yet effective enterprise. Rapid expansion of productive tracts and abandonment of unprofitable wells organized the industry by what I call an ethic of extraction, in which the oil industry's primary concern was the next frontier and not the footprint it left behind. From the beginning, this legacy has included spills. In fact, in one of the most bizarre twists in the story of human uses of petroleum, and I could talk more about this in questions if you want, Ben Franklin was one of the first individuals to grow frustrated with the idea of petroleum being without use and therefore value during the late 1700s. So he began experiments to put crude to work in the most obvious application he knew, spilling it on purpose. His thought, as you can see if you have a chance to read that whole text from his notes, was that it would calm waters. It would calm the ocean, especially in harbors. And for a time, many ships carried little barrels of oil that they would use in an effort to do that. Even when oil found other uses, spills continued. Once a commodity, shipping down Oil Creek in Pennsylvania required false floods called freshets that resulted in more than half of the loaded crude being spilled. In addition, the slight Oil Creek housed the first offshore wells, even if only in a few feet of water. Finally, most of the early derricks were put on the hillsides along the creek with waste crude and loosened soil running consistently into the stream. Similar to today's Gulf of Mexico, Oil Creek in the 1860s seemed at times to serve as part of petroleum's industrial apparatus. In fact, spilled oil has always been part of humans' use of petroleum. And there is little reason, as Ty was saying, to expect that this can ever be entirely altered, particularly if oversight remains slight. History's clear lesson is that the Gulf spill is simply the most recent. As long as we need oil, there will be spills in locales governed by petroleum's ethic of extraction. When 1860s Americans demanded visual evidence of the bizarre enterprise, Americans received written descriptions of glass print or glass print negatives shown with a lantern cast onto the wall, of derricks, wagons, wooden pipelines, and accidental fires. Americans approached the scenes with no geological knowledge of petroleum whatsoever. Truly, few observers even knew what the oil could be used for at that time. Each of the images of the 1860s piqued the public's intrigue to see an entirely new interaction between humans and the earth. Oil spraying from the ground, derricks controlling its flow, and barrels carrying crude to consumers. In scientific journals, geologists even pondered whether or not the escaping lubricant might cause the earth to stop spinning. By contrast, contemporary viewers know more than they would like about petroleum. Hard to find and swiftly diminishing in supply, crude is now a critical component of global diplomacy and even a rationale for war. For this reason, I encourage historians to frame this event, the spill we're talking about, within the larger story of humans' evolving relationship with petroleum, what I call our crude reality. Influenced by historical patterns of resource development and commodity management, this context for the Gulf spill of 2010 presents this tragic industrial accident as a product of industrial and regulative shortcomings, in which consumers are clearly complicit. As a material artifact, possibly none can capture this reality as effective as the live video feed. In its simplicity, we find links to the larger lessons and implications of a great environmental disaster of our time. The live video feed arrived on viewers' television or computer screens through the use of a series of complex undersea tools. Just as undersea robotic devices carried out much of the repair work on the wellhead, each device also contained cameras, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. normally owned by one of the large technical supply companies and leased by BP or another oil giant. They carried out the operational maintenance duties by providing a visual link to the undersea activities that have come to dominate current oil exploration. ROVs and the infrastructure used to harvest petroleum from deep in the ocean are an indication of a great technological advancement. However, they also indicate the growing scarcity of petroleum, which now draws humans to more complex environments that require greater expense and risk. Before they provided 24/7 coverage of spillage, ROVs used their downtime to increase our knowledge, believe it or not, of the marine world, from locating lost shipwrecks to charting the migratory patterns of the Greenland shark. In an era of reality TV, though, these same cameras brought images of an ongoing saga reminiscent of the 1998 film The Truman Show, in which a massive, rapt TV audience watches the unknowing main character live a quote-unquote normal life. For most of us, the summer of 2010 dissolved into the first real-time environmental disaster on record. Initially, the primary role for the live video feed was to satisfy the public's demand for transparency. In truth, it was a check to assuage the public's incendiary suspicion of big oil. Proof was needed to demonstrate the significance of the accident, and frankly, an oil company was the last voice most Americans were willing to trust. When BP initially estimated minor leakage rates and very little impact on the Gulf, the footage from the live feed became the quote-unquote smoking gun, the pluming wellhead that allowed the American public to bypass corporate or even government misinformation. That was before you came on the scene, Tom. There could be no denying the veracity of the image streaming from BP's own ROV. It was a moment of live environmental theater that might have immortalized any number of previous disasters that were instead left unrecorded and uncorroborated. Thanks to the live video feed, the Gulf spill could be different, publicly revealing an indisputable vision of negligence, and could be easily connected to environmental problems on the surface. The White House joined Representative Edward Markey, a Massachusetts Democrat, to demand that the Deepwater Horizon leak be shown to Americans live as it happened. This may be BP's footage, he said, but it's America's ocean. Markey went on to say, now anyone will be able to see the real-time effects the BP spill is having on our ocean. This footage will aid analysis by independent scientists blocked by BP from coming to see the spill. That's the end of his quote. Almost immediately, private scientists joined with NOAA and other federal experts to protest BP's low estimate of flow rates. BP initially put the figure at 1,000 to 5,000 barrels per day, or no more than 210,000 gallons. By July 2010, most experts agreed that all along the flow rate had been between 25,000 and 80,000 barrels per day. Analysis of the size and dimensions of the plume in the live video feed offered a primary source of external evaluation. Without the use of the live video feed, many industry observers believed that BP would have been able to control the image of the spill while denying its reality. Since the days of Rockefeller over a century ago, information control has defined the emergence of quote-unquote big oil, as Americans simply expected the gasoline to magically appear in highly stylized gas stations. Instead of understanding the complex infrastructure of extraction, processing, and transporting crude, we merely wanted it to be in our tanks for as little cost as possible. The live video feed presented a crack in the veneer of this illusion. In fact, mining for petroleum was a complex, risky undertaking, and similar industrial accidents could occur at any time. Worse yet, the process to extract oil from this deep water site was obviously so technical and expensive, rivaling only space exploration, that only a very desperate developer would find the pursuit worthwhile. Reading into the scene, then, the live video feed serves as a snapshot of the scarcity of crude in the 21st century. Figuratively, the work of my colleagues up here functions similarly to the live video feed at that moment. Now, however, our task is to make the memory of the entire event, to figure out where it fits in. The live video feed suggests we are a generation of petroleum gluttons who are all too aware of two looming realities. One, the supply of petroleum will end. We know it and we have to live with it. And two, and use of it is damaging Earth and the creatures living on it, including ourselves. For a fleeting summer, the live video feed reminded us of this devil's bargain with oil. The crude reality, though, is that despite the capping of this well in the Gulf, other spills occur or are ongoing in the Niger Delta, the jungles of Venezuela, or the frozen tundra of Alaska. Endless locales with neither a live video feed nor a rapt, outraged public of viewers. Thanks for the efforts by colleagues to bring this event to the public's attention. I think we make a slight change in that. Could become even a bigger change, and this is a great service to both our public struggling with our moment of an energy transition and also the scholars who will study this moment in years to come and figure out what we did because of this crossroads we were at. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Our next speaker is Diane Austin. She is a associate research anthropologist at the Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology at the University of Arizona's School of Anthropology, where she also holds an appointment as an associate research professor. She's the author of dozens of journal articles and scholarly reports. In 2010, she shared with Ty Priest and other co-authors the U.S. Department of the Interior's Partners in Conservation Award for her work on a volume on the history of the offshore oil and gas history industry in southern Louisiana, of which she was the lead principal investigator. Among her current research projects is a study being prepared for the Environmental Impact Assessment Review, rethinking the assessment of social impacts of offshore petroleum development in the Gulf of Mexico. She also has won several teaching and mentorship awards, including being named in 2008 the University of Arizona's Distinguished Outreach Professor. She also has been the recipient of numerous grants and contracts, nearly 40 of them since the late 1990s, which have supported her wide range of research. Welcome, Diane.
Well, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy kind of getting outside of our own disciplinary boxes and listening and hearing from other folks. Now, let me see if I can get myself on. Yes, indeed. Okay. And then, okay, F5. Thank you. All right. So, we've gotten some background and some context, and what I want to talk about is some of the work that is ongoing and some of the challenges both Ty and Brian, I'm sorry, I was going to call you Matt. Ty and Brian talked about the importance of getting the stories and understanding the stories. Well, there's some challenges to that, and I want to talk a little bit about that, and how we're, in fact, combining oral history as an approach with ethnographic interviewing and why we're doing some of that. I've actually been working for almost 15 years in the Gulf of Mexico. Started off with what seemed like a very simple, short-term, few-year project looking at what, at that point, the MMS thought was going to be the study of, the history and early history of the oil and gas industry. And as you can tell, those studies just keep going and going and going, and we may never finish as things keep happening. I put these pictures on because I just give you a little sense. The left one, for sale or lease property, some of the very real impacts that people are living right now in southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, as the economy, which was already in a downturn, is definitely affected. I'm going to talk a little more about that. The one on the right is what a long-term friend from Morgan City calls mental health in a bag. This is one of the responses, is that there are agencies now that go around and distribute these, and it has the comic book to read to your child, Know When You're Under Stress. It has the adult version of stress management, and notice it has that squeeze ball, so when you're feeling stressed, you can squeeze that. So it gives you a little bit, I hope, of a sense of what we've already heard, which is this is not an event. This was multiple events, and they're ongoing. The situation in the Gulf is dynamic, and so as Ty alluded to, the challenge of studying history while it is continuing to occur. The explosion we know about, the fact many people in this region, and as here in Houston and in this region, have friends, family, colleagues who work offshore. And so when people die in this industry, that is an effect itself that just reverberates. The fact that people are injured, the survivors and what they were facing. Of course, we've heard about the spill. Well, the cleanup itself caused all sorts of impacts, from the use of the dispersants, the booms, the mopping, the people's interactions with the oil wildlife and vegetation, then the investigations, the hearings, the moratorium that occurred. And then right after this event occurred, basically what happened, as Ty mentioned, we've got a couple of studies that were ongoing when the rig exploded, and were shortly afterwards contacted to say, can you respond fairly quickly to helping us understand the effects of this disaster. And so I have been in the Gulf every other month since May, alternating between Arizona and Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, trying to work with researchers, and I'll talk a little more about our approaches. But one of the first community members that I talked to when I said, you know, we've been asked to come back and look at this, and to develop some short, medium, long-term study plans for understanding the effects, she looked at me and she said, attorneys and reporters. She said, those are the effects. And she began, and as I kept that in my head, as I went through person after person after person, and I'm interviewing the emergency response person for one of the parishes in September, and talking about what the effects and almost everything, and I'm thinking, you know, he's going to be talking about having to deploy people and move. He talked about having to deal with all the reporters. This is an ongoing theme. The reporters come in with a story in mind. They will tell people, you know, I want to talk to a net maker, a shrimper, I need to see the oil, I want to do this. They have their story written and they just needed to fill the gaps. So one of the challenges I think we all face is there is a lot of information out there now about this event. Lots of news reports, newspaper articles, magazines, blogs, journals, etc. How do we sort through and help people think about how to sort through all of this as this continues? We live in a very different age, as has already been pointed out by Brian, in terms of information that's available to people and what that means and what will persist over time. Then, of course, just volunteers. I had one organization I've known for a long time that contacted me and said, we have 10,000 names on a list of people who want to come and volunteer to help with the cleanup. Do you have any ideas of what we could do with these people? You know, this is not, what is important there is this is in the context not only of a long-term oil industry, but as Ty mentioned, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. We've got communities that had become a focal point in the U.S. for lots of college campuses to do their alternative spring breaks, to do their study programs, to do their come down. A friend was just telling me a couple days ago, I got a call, this university wants to bring students for one day. They want us to plan a day for their students to have this work experience. And then they'd like for us to organize a dinner with the residents so they can talk about the spiritual and religious beliefs, because it's a religious studies class. You know, this is the kind, so when we talk about impacts, impacts are huge and they're way beyond what we might be thinking of at the moment. And of course, as we're hearing and have heard, the ongoing regulatory changes, the increased inspections, what other things are coming out of this, as well as the reparations. The BP claims process, how that went, the ongoing Gulf Coast claims facilities, the lawsuits, this is all going to continue to gather effects. Now, I'm going to use this as one example. These are titles from periodicals and give you a story. I was at a meeting in May with some activists and people trying to organize, and it was for another purpose, but this event had already happened, and so there was a group there saying, we have got to look at this event. This is going to have huge effects. This was a meeting, people from Louisiana to Alabama who work in housing issues and environmental issues. And a lot of the people were saying, no, we can't disrupt our agenda. We have an agenda and it's this. And so after the course of the meeting, the group that said, this is going to affect everybody, had gotten a little bit of play and people were listening. And at the end prayer, everybody joined hands and we prayed for, you know, all kinds of good things. And then at the end, the person leading the prayer said, and we pray for the fishermen, the people who work in the fish plants, and those who work in restaurants that serve mostly seafood, who are going to be affected by this spill. That is where people were in May, in their idea of where the effects of this were going to be. And think how very specific. The people who work in restaurants that serve mostly seafood, okay, that it's going to be, and you can see the media. It was very similar. It's the fishing industry, it's the fishing industry. What's going to be affected, and I'm not going to tell you they're not, and I'm assuming that Louis is going to talk a little more about how we understand some of that, but simply to recognize that that audience is much broader. And so what we're doing, we've got 4 universities, 8 community researchers. We're doing oral history and anonymous interviews and being able to put out and document information that people want to tell. This is a very sensitive topic. This is an area that has a huge dependency on the industry. So what people will say in an oral history interview, and we have people who agree to do the oral history interview and talk about, working in the industry, talking about, we have lots of spills in the Gulf, we have lots of explosions in the Gulf, this is one of many. But then there'll be a point where turn off the tape recorder, we want to talk. So we're doing both so that we can try and understand, and I think that's a huge challenge for us. We have drop-in visits, regular visits with everybody from the florist to the fish plant, etc., focus groups, and then posters and photos and all kinds of things that we're gathering to collect and put together. When we did the history study that's already been mentioned, the one that technically ended in 2008, we have over 1,500 digital photos that people donated because we'd go to interview them and they have their photos and they want to put those together. So looking at how to collect that. At the bottom, I've listed some of the sectors that we have created matrices. We have to make sure we're gathering the stories from all of these different people if we're really going to understand what this means to people. And you can see quite a wide variety of people who are on that list, and it grows and evolves as we go. And so that was actually the same slide. What I'm going to end with are just a few of those photos. Just to give you a sense, this is in Lafourche Parish. This no longer exists on the wall. They've repainted it. But this is a tattoo parlor. And the images just kept emerging. They'd had one, and they added another and another. So just to give you a sense there. This is Lafayette, Louisiana, September 2010. Okay? Buy our sandwiches, but please lift the moratorium. This pervasive, as I told you, the attorneys, oil spill claims. You have to understand there's a whole industry out there of people who are already attorneys for offshore damages, so people mobilize very quickly. Now here's La Rose, Louisiana. This is the French Food Festival, and they were very concerned they wouldn't even have the festival, depending on whether they had seafood or anything, and so they developed this as their theme, and now you see bumper stickers and things all over. Note at the top who the sponsors of the festival are, okay? This is embedded in the community. You don't separate these industries and the people. All right, this is the sign. If you don't know, when a person who sells oysters doesn't have any oysters, they put the empty sack over their sign. And I think this is of February, very recently. A huge issue are the oyster fishermen and what's going to happen there. So I believe that's my last one. And then we can talk further as we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Our final speaker is Louis Kyriakoudes. Since 2008, he has served as director for the Center for Oral History and Cultural Heritage at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he has held a faculty appointment in the Department of History for more than a decade prior to that. He's the author of The Social Origins of the Urban South, Race, Gender, and Migration in Nashville and Middle Tennessee, 1890 to 1930, University of North Carolina Press book. And he is co-editor of the forthcoming Southern Society and Its Transformations, 1790 to 1860, University of Missouri Press. He's published numerous scholarly articles and book reviews, and his current research topics include Why Do We Smoke?, Culture, History, and the North American Origins of the Global Tobacco Epidemic, and The Rural Roots of Inequality, Southern Agriculture, Globalization, and the Rise of America's Underclass, 1840 to 2000. Louis has been a principal investigator for the Mississippi Oral History Project, funded by the Mississippi Humanities Council, and a research team leader for a study sponsored in part by the National Cancer Institute, public understanding of the risks of tobacco use and passive smoking. In 2005, he received the University of Southern Mississippi's Aubrey Keith Lucas and Ella Lucas Faculty Excellence Award. Please welcome Louis.
Thank you. Let me get my pictures up. Well, I don't come here as an expert in the oil and petroleum industry, as you can tell from the introduction, although I do come here as somebody who has had to live through this oil spill for the past year, particularly in June and July when they were burning most of the oil off of the water when I would leave my house, which is in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, right on the Gulf Coast, the western portion of the state, and the border with Louisiana. We would smell this thick, cloying smell that was a lot like, reminded me when I was a kid and I decided to melt crayons on a 100-watt light bulb. So it hasn't been fun, and in many ways the community stress and the lack of information from the inside of this has been terrific, even though I have no formal connection to the petroleum and gas industry for my livelihood. I do fish, though, and that is one of the things that I'm concerned about. Well, more specifically, my purpose for being here is to tell you about a project that I've just begun with funding from NOAA Fisheries. That is the National Marine Fisheries Service, a branch of NOAA responsible for managing our waters. And this project grew out of a conversation between me and a bunch of anthropologists at NOAA Fisheries, people I have become friends with and have very high regard, in particularly Susan Abbott Jamieson, who had just recently retired, heads up the social science division of NOAA Fisheries. And we put together a proposal which went through the peer review process and was approved, a Deepwater Horizon Oil Disaster Oral History Project. And so in some ways, we're working in the same corner of the world and kind of seeking the same kinds of questions, although the way I've conceived our project is a little bit different. We're a little bit smaller, maybe a lot smaller, more focused, more historical, and more strictly oral history oriented and not ethnographic in terms of our methods. But we're funded from NOAA Fisheries, and our major partner is the Northern Gulf Institute, which is a multi-institutional research organization geared towards studying the northern Gulf of Mexico and based at Stennis Space Center in Hancock County, Mississippi, which happens to be where I live. We've conceived of this project as a kind of life story approach, that is, long narratives with people who are at least directly or indirectly involved in some aspect of marine fishing and harvesting. We have a large geographic area. We have people in each of these places, but basically from Pensacola, Florida, to the Texas-Louisiana border. And my goals for this project are, again, a little bit different. I am deeply interested in the effect of the oil spill, but the oil spill is one of many disasters in an ecologically and economically troubled zone. That is the northern Gulf of Mexico. Low incomes, bad health outcomes, Hurricane Katrina. We could talk about that one for hours. I've lived on that area for quite a while, including having to live through that. And so I see a real need to document a kind of long perspective, particularly local fisheries knowledge. Ecological degradation is a significant problem. Wetlands loss, changing technologies in fishing, global competition, declining shrimp prices, increasing input costs, diesel fuel, and what have you, are all problems. And so I'm hoping to document some of these longer term and more kind of fundamental issues related to the fisheries. Our formal justification under the grant is to create baseline data, so that helps support that research goal. And another issue that I think is very important is documenting the informal fisheries industry networks. Oystermen, shrimpers, fin and longline fishermen, which is not as big an industry there as the other two, all rely on a network of informal associations. It's largely a cash-only basis that's built heavily on trust. And I think documenting these networks is very important, at least from a policy goal. If the industry is significantly disrupted, this will provide an information base that might be available to reconstruct the fisheries industry later on. And then finally, of course, we want to document the human impact of the oil disaster. It really is a mess, and we've heard plenty about that, so I don't need to go on. One of my big challenges as the director of a Center for Oral History is access. We're very good, generally, as historians in gathering the information, but then making it available is a little bit tougher because it's expensive, time-consuming, hard, and so since I've been able to work on this grant from the beginning, and it's a substantial amount of money, $200,000 in total costs, $136,000 in direct billable costs. We're going to invest heavily in transcription, coding, subject coding using Atlas TI, which is one of the various kind of anthropologically oriented databases, and we want to get it up on the web as quickly as possible. Anyone familiar with these issues knows that putting things on the web is easier said than done, but there are some interfaces that we can use that are pre-existing. In particular, NOAA's Voices from the Fisheries, which is a wonderful repository for NOAA's ongoing oral history projects from other parts of the country, and we'll also have long-term storage at our university archives. And so it's important for us to get this material out there to be useful for people as soon as we can. And these are the web screenshots of the webs. Just to have a sense as to what we're talking about, and you know, this is the northern Gulf region. This is a map from the New York Times showing basically where the oil hit. Here is where I'm located. University of Southern Mississippi is just up here. My university has major research facilities here and here, something called the Gulf Research Institute. But you can see in the lower portion of what we call the bird's foot, or the technical Mississippi Delta, was heavily oiled. As a rule, the oil headed towards the east, towards Alabama and Florida, and towards the west, Barataria Bay, Terrebonne Parish, and those places. And those areas were particularly hard hit. When the winds would blow one way or another, we would also get oil. One of the ways they kept the oil out of where we were and the eastern portion of the river was by essentially opening up the floodgates up the Mississippi River and allowing large freshets of fresh water to come through, which subsequently destroyed the oyster beds. And so a lot of the damage from the economic damage from the spill is kind of secondary damage created by the way policymakers responded to the spill. I'm not suggesting that that wasn't a good response. I have no expertise to evaluate that whatsoever. But it's to say that, like you were saying, it's multiple disasters that happen sequentially over time. Another thing, it's good to keep in mind what this environment is like. I drive 82 miles to work each way, and that makes me a high user of petroleum, which is bad. But I do it because this is the most beautiful place I've ever seen. I absolutely love it. It gets me, I choke up about it when I think about it. I'm 2.5 blocks from the water. It's a little bit too much of me in this talk, I'm sorry, but it's really a remarkable environment. I've lived near the water almost my entire life, southeastern North Carolina, now the southern coast, South Mississippi, and it's just remarkable. And these are just some pictures that I've taken, give you an idea of what this is like. It's also an industrial environment. And people don't appreciate how industrial South Louisiana and South Mississippi are. It's industrial in the physicality of the environment. Here are some natural gas. They're actually both natural gas facilities. In these pictures, pipeline interchanges. But it's also industrial in the way that people have come to South Louisiana, the way they've lived, and what they do for a living. People alternate between oil work and shrimping, both individually in their career path and over the life course, or in families. You know, one will go into oil, one will go into the seafood industry. These all blend together, which makes unpacking culture and lifestyle ways in South Louisiana and Mississippi very complex. Another issue, too, is there's a strong impulse, and the reporters have been especially guilty of this, is to romanticize and to primitivize the people of South Louisiana. They do speak differently. It's hard. You have to, you get used to it. You know, I was born in New York. I have enough of a New York brogue. Sometimes people think I'm from another area from around there, you know, because I don't speak very clearly all the time. But these are sophisticated people, and they're sharp people, and they're people that are well-traveled. And I know that you're finding this in your interviews. You know, men in their 50s and 60s who, in the 1970s, were, you know, up in opening up the North Sea, and, with the English North Sea oil and the Norwegian offshore oil industry, you know, and then traveling, you know, all over Europe, and then coming back home to this very unique environment. They go from one world to another with relative ease and great frequency. So these are not rubes. Yokloski, Louisiana is another example of how this is industrial. It's highly ethnically diverse. You know, we think of classic immigration destinations, the Lower East Side of New York. South Louisiana is just chock full of immigrants, both the old immigrants from Central Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean basin that came after 1880, and new immigrants, most particularly Vietnamese, but Laotians, Cambodians, and other South Asians. And so it's a highly complex environment. Yokloski is founded by, or is an area that is home to lots of people of Croatian descent, particularly active in the oyster industry on the eastern side of the marshes. It's also a place, if you're a sportsman or sportswoman, fishing and hunting are remarkable. That is a pile of fish that was caught in about 2 hours, 4 guys. The pig was shot with a pistol. I did not shoot the pig, I caught the fish. I wasn't interested in the pig, but somebody else was on our boat. Here are just some scenes of preparing for the spill. One of the things that I think everybody down there experienced, particularly in May and June, as the lack of information seemed to create this giant black hole, was this sense of foreboding and dread. I actually brought my son towards the end of May down to the beach in Pass Christian on the other side of the Bay of St. Louis, where I live, to look at the beach, because we all were convinced that large sheets of black oil were going to come and permanently rob this resource from us, to take it from us. Well, fortunately that didn't happen, but there's still plenty of oil did come ashore. Okay. Here, laying out the boom, the one on your right is an oyster boat fitted with oil skimming devices. Many boats, you know, many people found themselves in that area. These are all pictures taken by me or my wife, or my wife's good friend, of the oiled beaches, the oiled water, and the sea life that was destroyed as a function of the spill. A big concern is the dispersant. People are in many ways more concerned about the long-term effects of this dispersant than they are of the oil, which seems tangible and understandable to them, but what is in the dispersant, nobody really knows. Much of the dispersant was broadcast airborne from C-135s, or C-130s, spoke, from Stennis Airport, which is just up the road from me. And my wife went and took these pictures of the dispersant on the tarmac before it was loaded on the planes. The other big issue is who's going to control the narrative of this spill? And this is very important. I think this is an area where historians have a particularly important role to play. BP is inundating South Mississippi and Louisiana with their PR campaign. We're going to make it right. They take out full-page ads in all the newspapers, and believe me, I live in a town with a tiny newspaper, and they love that advertisement because they pay cash and they pay the bill quickly. So you know, I'm not going to say yeah, I mean that there's a necessary influence there in the media. I don't want to go beyond what the evidence will support. But BP is also using oral history methods in a way to help define this. And I'm going to show you part of their video program that should load very quickly. Voices from the Gulf. And this will just take a second.
My family's been fishing for 8 generations. I've been fishing the Gulf for 40 years. It's just the way of life. When we first got the news of the oil spill, we thought it was the end of the world. BP said they were trying to make it right. They rented my boat, hired us to help with the cleanup. I made up my losses, paid me
Well, Pete's doing well. Although I don't know how he makes a living with a 17 center console boat like that, but maybe he's got a bigger boat. Very quickly, just let's hear the people that we're talking to. The English is coming.
Season because shrimp price has been down, and we're very hopeful to have a good season this year. But ever since the oil spill, we are financially devastated.
This is Doc Trong, a person we've interviewed, and it's his daughter, Angel, who's translating. And just some short clips.
Ông rồi thì nó kêu ra tìm dầu, chạy ra kiếm dầu rồi gọi vô nó biết không.
We've been surveillance, pretty much a surveillance boat for BP. We go up there to search or to see if there's any oil on the surface, and then we would call the radio back where that oil is. Ba ra ngoài biển mà thấy cái gì?
Thì chạy cũng thấy dầu nổi lên mà.
I see oil on the surface, on the water.
Kết bờ khoảng chừng 5-10 mai là có điều.
5-10 miles from shore, oil everywhere.
That's pretty close then. How often will he be able to, or how much longer will he be able to participate in this program? Does he know?
Bạn có biết là ba làm trong cái chương trình này bao lâu nữa không?
Không biết.
No, I don't know.
So it's just a day by day basis?
Mỗi ngày.
Đây. Yes.
Day by day?
Yes.
Okay.
And just one of the groups that we're focusing on the Vietnamese community because we have a long-term relationship both with the New Orleans and Biloxi-based communities in my center, going back to our Katrina work. Just one last clip since I've run out of time. Daniel Nguyen, who is a native-born American speaking Vietnamese American, and is basically telling us what's going on in his community in New Orleans.
Most people, especially the fish folks you're talking to, will say that BP oil spill is probably worse than Katrina, just because Katrina came and went, and the community knew when they could start, rebuilding again. But with the oil spill, they're uncertain about how long it will last. They're not able to go back to work, and this isn't something tangible or like completely tangible within their control that they can fix themselves. So that's one of the big issues with the BP oil disasters. People's ability to self-determine is mostly taken away.
The last clip is very short.
As the oil spill has progressed, and especially with the claims process being so taxing on people, having to prove their income, having to prove their livelihood, it's just a very tedious process, and it puts a lot of stress on them, and them not being able to control when they get the money, having to wait months on end to get a claims check to even pay off a mortgage, or having the prospect of going homeless, which many people have. They've gone homeless because of oil spill, having to sell their boats and cars. We have seen a lot of mental health issues, and you have to keep in mind that mental health is a taboo in the community. So for folks to be coming out and saying these things, and for us to see the signs, to me that it's really bad for folks not to keep it on the down low.
And so we've got a big project ahead of us. Thank you.